Michelle.
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a kind of looking back, summary, review, thoughts, post-class, a kind of post-class discussion of the Parallax class we just finished up on belonging again.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. We always appreciate and are honored to be invited to Parallax to teach there, and it was great to get a chance to teach a course on our recent release, our book Belonging Again 2.1, an address, and it was fantastic. It was wonderful to have the class there and the participants, and we do have this casual bonfire session in the mornings, and then in the afternoons we do the class morning, afternoon for our time, for our time zone. But yeah, I think that it was really neat to explore the topics of belonging again, and address with others in dialogue, and just to see how these things relate to, other types of concepts that can come up a lot, like for us, which is, things like the apathetic or beauty or, like, what does it have to do, like, if thinking about scaling and how does that affect, how is that even related to our everyday life and things like that. So, yeah, I think it was a great opportunity to have that exploration with others and see the discussions that came forth from it. And, really neat to also teach on the book, like, because I think it brings things out maybe in a different manner than reading would, but I think at the same time the reading also offers its own unique experience too. So we hope that it was beneficial for folks.
We enjoyed it. It also was nice to hear what belonging means to different people. We had a wonderful class of wonderful people involved, and their cool contributions were fantastic. Just all of the different people. And it was also interesting, just some of the questions that people brought, like, on how they thought about the sections on what it would mean to leave Plato's cave on your own, and those kind of tensions, and what is menti-divergence as opposed to just rationality or IQ or being smarter in that way. And those differences, or Simone Weil, attention and awareness, and just to hear people's kind of their personal stories and their personal kind of just on the ideas that it does seem to people, like people just talking about their own personal experience, how it does seem like it's really important to be able to think about the schema in which rationality is situated. Otherwise you end up in what Simone Weil called affliction, this kind of way in which doing what is most intelligent or brilliant just keeps you continually kind of locked in the pre-existing system, and how people relate that to family dynamics, personal dynamics, emotional dynamics, and things like that. I think also how people, it is interesting because when you're talking about scaling belonging and not doing it in a totalitarian way, I think one of the things it shows, because there's kind of a contradiction in that, there's like a paradox that seems impossible. Like, what would it mean to scale small group dynamics globally, to use a kind of notion from Michelle Bowen's, and how that's a kind of contradiction. But it is very interesting how trying to think something like that seems like a contradiction is so generative. And I think actually it suggests what education and learning should do, is where you get a group together to think something that seems like we need to do but is contradictory, and how that actually generates excitement. Whereas it's funny, because if you're just teaching non-contradiction in a sense, the answers that everyone knows, it doesn't excite, it doesn't bring people in. And I do think it suggests kind of what we should be doing in education and discussions, is actually approaching things that seem impossible. It makes me think of Levo Setston, kind of the teacher of Benjamin Fontaine, who really said that freedom was found in the impossible, like trying to approach the impossible, because otherwise we're a slave of the possible. And I really think that we need to do more of kind of intentionally trying to think things that seem contradictory. Because that's when you get all of the different personal takes on these personal angles, and like an education centered on something that seems contradictory generates a very different atmosphere than an educational environment that is simply spreading stuff that's memorized.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point. And I think another thing that was interesting to me was about how how much fruitfulness, and sort of let's get into the nuance of intrinsic motivation that there was. Like there was, because that's a big theme for us, and also in belonging again to one. And I think it was great to sort of field some considerations on it that are very important and necessary to get into. You know, like, can you be intrinsically motivated to be like a megalomaniac or something like that? You know, so I think that's important, and I really do feel that there's quite a bit of, like you were saying, like generative conversation around such considerations. And well,
I mean, what's interesting, not to interrupt, is just kind of this, one of the tensions that come out, I think, in these discussions, or with sort of the things we need to address today, is how there's nothing inherently good and nothing inherently bad, in a sense. You know, St. Augustine basically said everything comes down to order. And there's this way in which there's a form of intrinsic motivation that can be used to create capital monopoly power, because you have the intrinsically motivated CEO who then who then gets all of the kind of market shares, right? And then you have the intrinsic motivation that's impulsive. But then it seems like without intrinsic motivation, you can't deal with, like Herman Minsky talks about business cycles in capitalism. You just kind of get continual business bursts, booms and busts. So you need to have intrinsic motivation plus the beautiful, or being toward lack. And I think that's part of the, well, honestly, that's one of the reasons why philosophy seems necessary, because it's not simply the right answer. It's the right order, you know, the right arrangement. And things don't tell you how they should be arranged. It's like Cardinal, Newman says, words don't tell you what they mean. Well, things don't tell you the right way to arrange them. And you've got to figure that out. And part of the issue of belonging, again, in a new way, is that so much of it seems to deal with the right arrangement of things, rightly ordering things, and thinking of them at the right timing. This is an entirely different way to think about ideas or solutions. You know, we tend to think about solutions as what do we need to do, not what is the right arrangement of variables, the right order of the unfolding. If we don't do that, then we're just stuck in binaries, as opposed to figuring out a new way to unfold something.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's important, order, and also, you know, the how, because it's not just about like the right answers, right, or the right solution. You know, here's the solution. It's a lot more of an art itself in many ways, right? Where there's a lot of different types of cultivation, in the sense that, like, it's like cultivation itself. It's like a process of growing and weeding and you know, that type of work. Not so much, you know, here's what it is, because like if you just say intrinsic motivation without the ordering and the other sort of nexus or like context of that, then that could be used to, like, you know, justify narcissism or whatever, you know. So it's like it's a very particular kind of what I want to say is that it's something that comes in concert, right? Which is like always about this just this, something where it's coming in concert is going to be various parts being able to make a song, make a melody, and be able to have that ability to really let that be like developed through the form of the work itself, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the issue is that there's this tension just in being humans in finite time, where you can't talk about everything all at once, which always means that you're at risk of sounding like the solution is one thing, because you can only talk about one thing. Like, space-time makes it really hard to be dialectical or complete, right? And so you have to talk about intrinsic motivation, but then you also have to locate it in the ability to discern and to judge, and then it has to be in the question of value. And then you have the issue where, if, you know, we're in sociology, where the external and the interior self has been kind of broken down because we've absorbed our social conditioning. So even our intrinsically motivated can just be conditioned by our extrinsic environment, you know, like Pierre Bourdieu, you know, these different sociologies talk about. Well, then we have to talk about all of that. You have to think about all of that. And I think that really kind of suggests one of the reasons why belonging, again, is so hard, or, you know, requires thinking through a lot, is because language and thought are sequential by definition, and what we're talking about is ultimately dialectical and it entails getting an order of a bunch of variables, but you can never talk about all the things all at once. And as you're doing the work of, say, justifying the necessity of intrinsic motivation, you're not simultaneously justifying the necessity of beauty, thus making it sound like you just need intrinsic motivation, and so you have to keep going. But that very necessity of holding all of that in mind, or holding all of the parts, again, suggests why something like philosophy is important today. Because the very fact that you must think in sequences, but kind of in a way betrays the thinking that you need for belonging again. It's like Hegel's distinction between understanding and reason. We're stuck in understanding. We don't naturally think reason, but what you need today is something more like reason. But this also gets into where we seemingly need infrastructure to continually train and incubate reason over understanding and dialectical thinking. Hence why we talked a lot about, and we've talked about it at Ojibwa's conversations, about liminal web as infrastructure, as an infrastructure that provides possibly exemplars in spaces of lifelong learning, which again, if there's something about human beings, as Hegel says, that's always just about to fall back into one-sidedness, fall back from reason into understanding. Like, even if you know the difference between understanding and reasoning, you can't ever get out of the risk of falling back into one-sidedness and non-dialectical thinking. So you need an infrastructure to continually train you, to continually incubate you on the side of reason and dialectics, and not losing sight that you need more than one thing, and that there's an order that you continually have to discern being maintained. And then, of course, problematically, if you lose that discernment, then you might be self-deceived from seeing it, and that's always a possibility too. So there's this need for this kind of continual infrastructure.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you're talking about how sometimes people get kind of, weary about trying to solve problems or philosophy and generally all that stuff. And I know that the words we're using might sound like there's this particular and order and stuff like that.
Sure.
Which seems like, okay, so you're saying it's not really about just an answer, but actually there's this answer, right?
Sure.
And I think that I can understand those concerns, but I think that it's really important to maybe just consider that those words can kind of seem really, because the thing is the way that we think about things, like you're talking about, like language kind of conditioning how we see reality or experience it, right? This is the same with our systems, right? A lot of our systems, they start to do a lot of our thinking for us. We think we're thinking something, ourselves, but it's something where it is informed in many ways by some systematic experience of reality, and even apprehension, or what's that word? Maybe it is apprehension. About what it is the case or whatever, So we kind of I kind of want to say that sometimes these words can come across, like I was saying, as it's almost a red herring to say, okay, well, it's about sort of this ordering in a mode versus just here's the answer. Because the thing is that the answer will not necessarily tell you what it means, right? We talk about this all the time with about facts and things like that, right? There's always that element of interpretation and hermeneutics. But the point of the matter is that when we hear those words, it's hard not to think of it as, oh, there's just this answer and there's this formula, and we're so kind of, I want to say, inculcated with this idea of 10 steps or self-help, or here's what and it's there's a place for these types of things, there's a place for the way institutions do education, where here's the test and here's the answers and here's your grade and whatever, right? But it's hard not to think about talking about such a subject without having the brain that's been conditioned to hear those words and think like this kind of, I don't know how to put it, but just, very much well, here, here's the solution, and here's the steps, and here's the order, versus thinking about order like you'll talk about, Daniel, in the celestial way, right? Where there's the orbiting and there's really no way to get around the fact, and there's a grace to it of the order of the universe, so that the sun isn't just so far that it there's a grace in the fact that the sun is just so far from the earth that we aren't completely destroyed by it, right? One way or the other, in heat or in freezing or in frost. So it's just, I guess what I mean to say is that we kind of lose that like grander connotation and sentiment with those words, and I feel like it can get very much reduced to the systematic way we've sort of felt it over many years. And so I think that's the tricky thing about it too, where it's hard to say, well, it's not simply about answers without still feeling like, but what you're really saying behind that is it is actually about these answers. Sure. Because in a way it isn't, right? Like it's order is all about that, right? Where like, for example, there's a certain, I mean, it's kind of particular in terms of how you plant certain things, or just plant in general, right? Like you can't just like throw your seeds on the rocks and expect it to grow.
Right.
There's a particular place or type of soil you'd need to use, right? So it's like there's something particular about that. But is it like bad or mean or like limiting or presumptuous that's what it is?
Right.
No, it's just how you grow things. I mean, and it's so I think and it's weird but when you even say that, it's like it still has this air of like again the presumptuous nature of it. And I think that's what's challenging, where it's like it's not so much to discuss something that has to be this way in a sense. Not any more than would say like that gravity works in certain ways, right? Yeah, so it's more like, I think if we think about it in light of the larger cosmos, we can think of it as like, I see, like these things do have these sort of repetitions or patterns or like propensities, but it's so I'm just saying, I think that's important, because I do think sometimes people just it's sort of like, well, why philosophy and considerations of these things when ultimately like we aren't we all just kind of guessing, or like aren't we all just kind of aren't philosophies just sort of like potentially oppressive, right? But I think what the aim hopefully in good philosophy, in the Humean sense of good philosophy, is not to have something hyper prescriptive, but rather to encourage and foster skills. Right, yes. Like actual skills.
Yes.
Right, just like the farmer's going to have skills to know how to plant things correctly, yes. Or when to plant and what. And is that presumptuous? I think it's just him learning how to do what he would like to do and do well. Yeah. If you don't want to do that, then you go and learn other skills, I suppose, right?
Yes.
But like it is important to think about it in terms of skills, or like you'll even say sometimes self-defense, right? Yeah. Versus prescription.
Yep. No, that's all very good. I mean, if I were to ask you, what is the solution to weeds? Well, you go out and do the work of weeding, or you get rid of your garden. And basically that's what, sure, we could deal with the problem of belonging again by simply removing pluralism, but that's that's a regression. But hey, if you want to go for isolationism or removing technology, okay, that'll work. Yep. So there are some removal strategies. Well, just don't do a garden. Okay, but if you're going to have a garden, then how are you going to deal with weeds?
Well, and I think, not to cut you off there,
Please.
But it's like, I think sometimes we sort of believe like somehow we will operate like that. The reality is that we tend to operate with underlying quote unquote solutions, whether we realize it or not, whether we like to admit it or not. And Absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge that in humility, because otherwise we think we kind of can judge any even hint of somebody trying to like speculate or consider, because and I understand, I empathize or sympathize, I always forget which word is best there. Sure. But with that concern, right, or sort of maybe even frustration.
Sure.
But I think that if it's like, people are still going to have conversations, okay? People are still going to do their life and make decisions, right? All of that's going to have something underlying it that you think is like quote unquote solving the problem or solving whatever it is. Like, you get up and you do a certain thing because it's solving the problem that you're hungry, or you have to get to a place at a certain time, or you have to make some big decision, like if you're gonna stay in a relationship or not. And like, I think that reveals, and I mean it's a point we've already spoken about many times before, but there's always these sort of underlying orientations, right? So to me, that's why it's important to be open. And sure, you might be open and end up realizing somebody's got some sort of like sledgehammer of a solution, right, that they're going around with. But that's not everybody, and even for that person, there's a kind of needing to have a type of grace for that, in a sense, not because that's necessarily right or you should encourage it. But like we talked about even in the class, right, the fact that people will have like people may be innovative and become like one of the tech heads who's like kind of seems controlling, right? I mean, I'm not saying that's great or anything like that, but are we going to regulate that possibility out of oblivion? Like, what are we going to do about that? But that also means you get people who are very genuinely hearted and not trying to control others, and they make really incredible things that help a lot of other humans. Right. So anyways, I just wanted to say all that because I think it's important.
I mean, there's no possibility of not acting based on an idea of what you think is best. Ergo, a solution. So if you say, well, the way to deal with problems is not try to solve it, then you're saying that the solution to dealing with problems is not trying to solve them, right? Like, it's like there's no such thing as a bad motivation.
But some people are like, well, that's word games, Daniel.
Well, it's not because you think it's best. Like, it just is all... It all comes back to Augustine in the sense that there's no such thing as a bad motivation. You can't motivate the bad. Like, if you motivate cutting yourself, you think it's good to cut yourself. You can't not motivate.
If you think it's best not to think about these things,
then your solution to these things is not thinking about them, right?
Yeah, or to not pay attention, not give much time to.
Yeah, you can't think a non-address per se.
Yeah.
Like you're always thinking.
You're always addressing it.
You're always
in some
addressing.
Way or another.
Yeah, you're always thinking the way to address.
Yeah,
like what is the best way to address, and so
that's the thing. I think people are like, no, I don't think there's a best way to address. I think it's just not. There is no best way to address it.
Then that's the best way to address it is to believe there's no best way, and it's not a word game because it can't be a word game where there's a choice. You have to make a choice on how you're going to treat it. And so it's not a word game if there's a choice. And there is a choice because you're going to choose to live your life X way or Y way.
Y way, right? Exactly.
It is precisely, again, one of the reasons why philosophy seems necessary is the problem of choice. And the problem is a lot of the choices are a result of things that seem like word games, but actually are not. Like, you actually do find yourself incapable of willing anything but what you think is best. You find yourself thrown, to use Heidegger's language, and having to address things. And even if you say the best address is not addressing, well, then that's the best address. And it's not a word. It isn't a word game because you choose to act that way. Yeah. It's an orientation of action. And this is where I do think Maurice Blondel's book on action is a gem that has to be unpacked. Because
What's the title?
Action. It's just basically where philosophy is always about action, ultimately. And reality is action. And so the problem of action is really the basis of philosophy. And you could think of action as basically Aristotelian metaphysics. Like things are acting in the world and there's agency, and yet they're always changing and staying the same.
Right.
So you find yourself in this state.
Right.
And like philosophy, to what you were also saying, is philosophy should be about skills. Like it always should be about skills. The issue is that philosophy are the skills of life, and the skills you need are not self-evident. And you do, in fact, even skills for like football. You watch tape, you talk about the game, you review, and what you're doing in philosophy is basically watching film for the game of life. You're talking about coaching for the game of life. It is a kind of sports athletic relationship, if you will. But the key is that philosophy, when you talk about it, like you almost want to call in, there's a funny way in which it's like philosophy is lifacy or something. Like it is, in fact, the problem of life. Like, the love of wisdom is the love of doing life well, right? Because wisdom is how you do life well. The problem is life doesn't tell you how to play the game. Like, life doesn't tell you what the game is. Well, you're just thrown into it, and there's apparently a game going on. Let's put it this way. Imagine that you were just born in the middle of a football game, and it was going on, and stuff was happening. And you were basically just found yourself in it. And you didn't even know the word football. You didn't even know about playbooks. You were thrown into the middle of a game of football and didn't even know about football. You knew nothing about football. And you found yourself in a kind of mystery of watching people say, well, they must be following some kind of action. Like, it seems too coordinated.
Like one side keeps going this way,
yeah, so there must be some logic here. So let me look around. And then when you go over to the coach, he's using all this jargon, and you say, so what are we doing? He's playbook and quarterback. What? There's all this jargon. What is he talking about? And there's this great confusion that comes. But then you look back and there's a feeling of wonder because there seems to be coordinated action. This is the relationship of philosophy to life. Like, you're thrown in the middle of this game called life, and there is a logic, there's some sort of coordination going on, and you just find yourself having to gather what's going on.
But the funny thing is that people, phenomenologically, will think that the jargon and all of that is they ascribe that to philosophy.
Yes.
And they say, like, this is complexifying something that you could maybe just intuit or you could just kind of get.
Yes.
And why are you thinking of life as a game anyway? You know, like, they maybe don't accept that premise or something
you could do all that if you found yourself in the middle of football. You don't need to learn quarterback. Just watch. Just intuit. There's something going on. Just accept. Just be simple. Just accept that something's happening, right? Or someone could come along and be like, what are you talking about? I don't see any harmony. I don't see any coordination. I mean, you could really, like the nihilist, or would be like, what are you talking about? There's nothing going on. Yeah. There's nothing happening. And then the coaches talk about quarterback, and it's like, it's a bunch of jargon. Well, you don't need that jargon. Just watch what's going on. Like, you could think of, well, what are the facts? Okay, there's 7. You try to quantify it in kind of an empiricism.
But I do think the fact that, like, sports do have quite a bit of jargon, and they have their little almost language, like they have an inside language, you know. It's like funny when you hear those terms, like there's this one scene in League of Their Own. Is that the
baseball film with the females? Tom Hanks? Yeah.
Yeah, there's this one scene where, like, he goes through all of the, like, the words, right? The jargon of, like, baseball or softball. I guess it was softball. Yeah. And, like, you know, if you're just like, what? You know? Yeah. And I always remember that. But the point of the matter is, why do they use those? Are they trying to do that to be complicated? Are they trying to do that to be difficult? No. They're doing that because it developed over so many X amount of years. It's a kind of a language for that sport, like you'd have a language if you go to China. Yeah. And is how it works, right? They do it actually for simplification, right? Yes. They do it because everybody knows what that means, and you say it quick, and then you can do it quick, right? Like, and so I guess what I mean to say is, in defense of jargon for a second, is that, you know, this is another heavy criticism of philosophy, right? It's a word salad. It's just, you know, and it's like, well, but, you know, people were just sort of grasping, right? They were trying to understand their world, right? They were trying to understand this quote-unquote game of life that they find themselves in. And they were trying to figure it out when they came up with these terms. Now, you can say those are unnecessary and too long and don't make sense. That's fine. But would you feel just as justified to go and say that to, like, the ball pit of, like, the baseball team?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you'd be like, well, no, like, they're just baseball players. Like, that's how they talk.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. That's exactly it.
Well,
and I think maybe the thought is like, well, but you're prescribing, like, or quote unquote prescribing, though you're not, but, like, it's like, oh, but we're thrusting this, like, this casting this net on this whole, like, world where where philosophy might be, you know, seem necessary, right? Yes. But it's like, nobody's saying baseball is necessary for everybody, right? But there's a difference between saying, like, philosophy jargon is necessary for everybody and that philosophy itself is underlying in every person's life because they make decisions, and so therefore it seems necessary, especially in a pluralistic age, you know?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. First, there are different, like, let's take football. There are different coaches. Some have bigger playbooks than others. There's more jargon than others. There are different styles of play. So sure, you can say, maybe you could say, well, this philosopher uses too much jargon, and that would be like, you could, like, some coaches have too complicated playbooks, right? Those critiques are all valid, right? But the fact that if you say this coach's playbook is too expansive, there's too much jargon, therefore football is stupid, like, that would be a different move. Right. Like, if you wanted to say this particular philosopher could streamline, and there is more jargon than necessary, and in fact it's a bad playbook, they're going to be a 1-12 team. You're not going to get anywhere with this philosophy. That's fine. But if you say, wow, this football team is going to be 1-12, therefore football doesn't exist or is a waste of time, that's an entirely different matter, right? And so people conflate, you can identify jargon or silliness in some philosophers, but you can see that in a coach's playbook and say, this is not a good coach. Okay, well, football still exists. You know, that's just one example of a bad playbook, right? Not all philosophy is jargon ridden. Like, David Hume isn't full of jargon, right? So you can't just make blanket statements that all philosophy is jargon. Likewise, you have one coach who has a really complicated playbook. You say, man, coach playbooks are so freaking confusing. Like, you can't make that generalization.
But that's the funny thing, because that's a type of reductionist.
It's very reductionist.
About, just say, philosophy in general, or football in general. When the very thing that is the critique is like, oh, you know, philosophers are reducing the world to this problem and this solution. Yes. Right. So it's like, it's a criticism, which then ends up, you're doing the thing you're criticizing ultimately. I mean, this is just one way to look at it, but it's like it could potentially be a critique of reductionism while you reduce.
Yes, that's exactly.
And it's like that's where I think, like, again, it's sort of going back to, like, this idea of just like that recognition of, like, oh, wait a second, that's, you know, I don't want to just sort of assume that, Now, maybe it's true. It might be a very fair assessment, but it's just that kind of fine line of like not assuming that.
I mean,
and certainly not practicing that which you're judging, basically.
Well, the question ultimately becomes, what is the basis for believing that you're always already in some sort of quote unquote game of life that needs philosophy, right? Like the hypothetical example is you find yourself, you just wake up in football and you don't know what football is, but you just find yourself in it, and you have to kind of like a detective figure out what's going on.
Well, and also like balls are flying, you're gonna get tackled. Like it's very much a live situation where if that were the case where you woke up and you're suddenly in it, it would be like, oh man, I got to figure this out.
Well, the issue is,
I'm gonna get hit.
If you looked around and saw all this activity going on, it would be reasonable eventually just by watching the patterns to say there are patterns. There seems to be an order. There seems to be stuff going on. Yep. This doesn't seem random.
Yep.
Maybe it is, but it doesn't seem random. Now, in a way, you can say, well, what, are you making an argument of design to God's existence? No, what we're doing is saying, like, when you go to Aristotle, like, he's like, if you pay attention to physics, everything's always changing. And yet it seems like things also stay intelligible at themselves. Yeah. That's weird. Like, you notice it seems to be some sort of pattern. And so observation leads into metaphysics. So if you just found yourself in football, maybe it takes 2,000 years, but eventually you might go, for all these years, there seems to be a recurring pattern, a kind of consistency here. Mm-hmm. And yet, where is that consistency? Why is that consistency there? There is a funny way in which you could say that some sort of sense of design or sense of unfolding of a thing that isn't random is at the basis of philosophy. Like the argument of design, some people will say design leads to evidence of God's existence. Mm-hmm. There's a way in which what we're saying is that for Aristotle, or many of the philosophers, there's this sense of if you pay attention, you see that there isn't really randomness going on. And if there's not, then something is reoccurring. That if it is reoccurring, it could be, or there wouldn't be any reason to think it couldn't be intelligible. And if it was intelligible, it could be written down and meditated upon more intentionally, which might open up new vistas of exploration and possibilities. Like once you really get, like if you pay attention, you say, I think there are teams. Well, if you can really provide evidence to think there are teams in this football game you find yourself in, from that you could say, maybe there are positions in these teams. Like you can stand on the shoulders of those that came before you, and then stand on the shoulders of and who are those people standing on the side? I used to think for a long time they had nothing to do with the game. What if they have something to do with the game? Mm-hmm. And you start standing on the shoulders of those that came before. That is the process of philosophy. And so the question is simply, what is the basis for thinking the hypothetical thought experiment of being born into a game of football without knowing what it is? Or waking up in a game of football. Amnesia, sure, of course. But why is there reason to think that is a reasonable thought experiment to consider the relationship of life and philosophy? Yeah, because that's how philosophy started. Paying attention and people seeing recurring patterns. Like seeing like recurring activities, recurring tendencies of human in speech to misunderstand one another, or people referring to something like beauty and justice and not knowing what it is. Just like you would observe recurring patterns of activity in football and begin to reason, climbing up by analogy, the analogy being you would start gradually proposing maybe there's actually an order to this that can be understood. And if we don't understand it, here's the key. Oh, wait, I'm in this game. Oh, I'm a player.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, get ready, y'all. There's a linebacker. You're gonna go down. I mean, and I don't mean that in like a. Sorry, that doesn't sound good. I'm not saying like you're gonna go down and like we talk a lot of failure is a very necessary part of life, of philosophy itself, and it's not to be averted entirely. I mean, but you also don't want to just walk off a cliff and be like, oh, well, failure. Well, it's like, well, no, you're dead now. Like, I think there's these kind of sliding scale of failure, too, of like...
Sure.
I guess what I mean to say is, the reason why I just say about getting tackled is, like, you have skin in the game. You have skin in the game in the sense that you're in it, if we want to...
Well, maybe a way to think of it is that you're in the game and it's like, why does that guy keep yelling at me for not catching this ball? Why is he yelling at me? Likewise, the philosopher's like, why?
It's consequential for you.
Yeah, why do societies keep falling apart? Why does, we keep...
Why do I keep getting, tackled?
Yeah, why do I keep misunderstanding people? Why do I keep getting in fights? Why does, society crumble?
But that's
and you go,
thing.
wait,
it's
because I'm in some sort of ordered game. Oh.
Right. Well, and that's where it's like a lot of people come to philosophy as, like Noel mentioned too, right? Which
from
like
crisis.
It's like stuff that just happened in your life, just stuff that happened in your life, and it's just like, okay, well that's odd, or that's interesting, or that's hard, and I don't know how to really understand that, and you could just leave it at that, I guess, right? But there's also a way in which you're like, if you think about football and getting tackled as the quarterback, let's just put it very much more clearly. If you cannot get tackled, that's ideal. Why is that ideal?
Yes.
Right? Because you're trying to get to a touchdown. Like now you might not agree that there's any point in getting a touchdown, so it doesn't really matter if you keep getting tackled, right? But if you accept the game, or if you realize, okay, I can actually improve in this game, it seems. I can do better in this game. And also, I don't really like getting tackled that much, right? Then you start doing, you seek to do things differently, or you seek to think about things in a new way, right? Because you're like, oh, okay, so I'm not just like in constant state of like perpetual confusion and paralysis. I'm going to learn a little bit about this. So, yeah.
No, it's well, because the other thing, you get tackled, and you look and nobody comes and like arrest that guy, or they let him do it again. You go, well,
what is going on?
What is going on? Like, so you get in a terrible problem at work with coworkers, and then everyone, like, no one takes responsibility and nothing changes. Like, what is going on?
What is it about human nature that
makes
happens?
this possible?
Exactly.
So you're like, well, there must be a way the brain works. There must be some sort of environment that I'm in that makes it okay for people to tackle you and not get in trouble.
But I think that's, again, going back to my earlier point about the phenomenological inculcation of many years of just thinking about it in terms of, answers, solutions. Or people maybe can even get weary when they hear that being said, because it's like, well, are you just trying to avoid the abyssal or the void of like not having an answer to that question? Like, you want to try to figure it out, you want to try and figure out patterns, and it's just like, but the reality is we do live in collaboration with certain patterns, right? With certain ordering of things. That's why we do certain things versus not, because of certain outcomes, right? And certain results, I suppose.
Well, I think sometimes, I've used the language, but there's a way in which the language metaphorically of problems and solutions is completely wrong. Because if I were to say, what is the solution of football? It's not really solutions to football. There are strategies of football. Mm-hmm. Philosophy is not about solutions, it's about strategies. It's more like best approaches, best orientations. Like, there is no solution because there's no solutions in football. Like, you could say the solution is to win. That's not really a solution. That's the completion. There's completion of it, like where strategy leads to the end point.
Right.
But I don't know if solution is the right metaphor. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is we're using the incorrect metaphoric structure by which life is a thing of strategies.
And the thing is, what's funny, it kind of speaks to like your point where we talk about like scaling and how things that scale tend to work whether you agree with it or not, right? Say you're in a football game, it's really a football game, okay? It doesn't matter if you think, like, if you have maybe a more nihilistic position where it's like, this is all pointless, there's no winning, even if you win, you're still gonna die, like, sorry. But it's like, but guess what? You're still gonna get tackled.
Yeah, that's
like,
right.
It does not matter what you think about this thing that's going on.
No.
What matters is how you develop your thinking. Like, does that make sense? It's like,
100%.
It's very important because that's the reality of life. You might not agree with it, and it's still going. Now, you take yourself out of that, unfortunately. Some people might choose that, and that is ultimately their decision. But what I mean to say is, like, if you're in it and you're still going to continue to live, you are going on with something that you did not predetermine yourself.
Yes.
So now you have to learn what to do within that. And
the strategies.
You might decide not to, but don't be shocked that you're constantly getting tackled or hit in the head with a football.
Yes.
And then being like, well, like being upset about it. It's like, well, you're also, sure, it feels unfair, but you're also not like dodging that. You're not like running from the linebacker or whatever.
Yes.
I hope I'm getting the terms right.
Well,
the positions right. But it's just important because it doesn't matter really it's weird.
Yes.
Like, that's what the revelation seems to be. It's like there's observational stuff it's both this, like, it's when we talk about subjectivity, right? Where it's like, it does matter, and there are things that it doesn't matter that you think this X way about it, but then you realize, because of that, accepting that, you can start to think in ways that change things radically. Yes. So it's like this really important dialectic of those two.
Well, and also, too, it doesn't matter if you say, is football transcendently grounded or objective? It doesn't, it's happening. Like, it's as objective as happening is, happenings. And so so it's all about strategy. Now, you can use the phenomenology move and say, what are the conditions of possibility necessary so that reality would be about strategy? What must reality be so that strategy is what it is about versus solutions and problems and solutions and different things, right? You can go to kind of those ontological questions from this observation of the necessity of strategy, but that's a move that you're still in the game. Like, whether you do that move or not, or you want to explore that, you must develop strategies or you're going to be tackled a lot. Like, so that's another thing. Like, people confuse where philosophy, let me put it this way. Philosophy can go into the phenomenological. It can go into the ontological. But rather it does or doesn't, philosophy as strategy is necessary. You may not care if, what the conditions of possibility are for reality to unfold the way it does. Doesn't matter. You're in the game. Like, fine, don't ask those questions, but you really should, probably develop strategies because, like you said, it doesn't matter if you're a nihilist, a Christian, atheist, whatever, you're tackled. You're in the game.
And just to kind of put it into concrete from that analogy is, you're going to need strategies can be helpful, right? So that you don't constantly, blow up on your loved ones, right?
Yes.
It's okay, or you just don't care. Right, you just don't care, but that does have an underlying philosophy too. You don't care if you're blowing up on people around you, right? So it's you still have some sort of thought of what is, like we said, best to do, right?
Yes.
So it's or you could develop strategies to realize what is setting you off, and then you can address those things in yourself and address certain things that you can, there's still going to be stuff out of your control, but you can also recognize what is in your control, which is often a lot more than you maybe would like to think, because you can actually work on yourself, realizing what's causing that for you, what's causing your overwhelm. Are you dealing with some of those inner things? But the thing is, that all relies on again, that would be the underlying philosophy of believing in improvement, right? Or believing in being able to develop strategies. But philosophy as strategy is really a helpful way to think about it, unless you don't want strategies. But again, then I don't know. I guess that again is a viable choice, but it is still a choice. You can say it's not, but it is still
it would only
a choice.
So one also too, when you think in terms of strategy, it is about action, it is about skills, it's also probabilities. It's what increases your probability of a certain result. So solutions are if I do X, I'll get intrinsic motivation. Well, if we think what are the best strategies to increase the probability of the conditions of developing it,
right,
that's a different way of thinking.
It's also probability. It's not guaranteed.
Yeah, it's not solutions. Probabilities are not solutions.
Right.
And strategy is about increased probability.
Yes, exactly.
And so that's a different orientation. And the other thing too is if you say, it just all comes down to, do you accept the premise that to be in life is to be thrown into something like football without knowing it? Is that thought experiment valid or not? And when you go back to the beginnings of metaphysics, they're we have to be in something because there is intelligibility. This is what it all, it's if there is intelligibility, there must be order. And if there is order, there's something going on.
Yes.
And if there's something going on, then it should be knowable. Maybe not completely, maybe not entirely, but it must be knowable to some degree, precisely because I just said something must be going on. Precisely because I am thinking and I am observing. Something is going on and it is intelligible. That's why I'm talking about it. So it is knowable to some degree, and the question is simply how knowable, and we can't know until we try. On those grounds, there is reason to suppose the metaphoric thought experiment of the football game you wake up in is valid, and if that is valid, then philosophy is definitely about strategy. Philosophy is definitely about strategy of dealing with this thing that's unfolding, that you're in, live. It's live. Right. Life is live. And if you simply say, no, you can simply say, football's a game, it's stupid, and I don't like it. Well, then the question is, okay, well, can you stop playing football other than by suicide? And if you say no, well, then what are you going to do? You're just going to get hit a lot? Are you just going to get hit? Are you going to, fail? Are you going to not make any points? What are you saying? So what are you going to do, right? And if you say nothing, well, you can't leave the game, so it's going to be a bad life. It's not going to be good. Or it's going to be fragile, or it's going to be risky. Maybe you get lucky, And for some reason, you just standing there, tackled. Like if you just stand on the field and no one...
It's like that old lady with the cricket in the lawn. She just crosses the street with the... She's closing her eyes, crossing the street with the little lucky cricket.
Yes.
And like, it's hilarious. Yes. She doesn't get hit, you know, and then she opens her eyes and she's like, see, I told you it was lucky. But like, meanwhile, there's been like car crashes all around her, or like wagon crashes.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like, you know, it's like, is that...
Maybe get lucky.
It's just not a very good bet.
Probability.
It's not a good probability.
No, maybe you're like, I don't care if I get hit.
You say that, and then you get hit. I mean, the problem is people say that, because they do that.
They say that, and then it's like,
or someone else pays the price. Your teammate gets hit.
And that's the thing. Like, you know, I don't know. I do think that, like, this idea of just, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to learn the rules of the game. I'm not going to try to not be tackled.
Yeah.
You know, I again, valid choice. People are going to make their choice.
Yeah, but your teammates get hit because you weren't guarding.
And that's the thing. I think until you start to realize, oh, wow, well, like, my decisions are hurting other people, too.
Yes,
like,
that's right.
Me not learning this is actually hurting other people.
Yes.
Like I said, if you don't learn strategies so that you don't blow up on people you love, that's hurting them, right? That's hurting yourself. That's hurting your relationships.
You're hurting your team.
Yeah. It's like, okay, so do you want that to keep going?
Yes.
Or not?
That's right.
You know, and so you have another choice to make, right? So,
but this is where having the right metaphor is important, because you say, well, I don't want it to go on, but also there are no solutions, so there's nothing we can do. Like, if you have the wrong metaphor, but that right there of realizing right metaphor is philosophy. That's the rub. Right. Like, another thing...
you can dispute it and say, well, I have a better metaphor. That game one's not so good. I mean, you could do that, but then...
you're looking for intelligibility.
Sure.
You're in the game.
And you're also still... You're going to be having to use some sort of philosophical thinking to get to derive an opposing view, right? Like,
if you're looking for a better approach, you're in the game. Like, the moment you're looking for a better approach, you're like looking for a better play in football. You're looking for a better strategy.
No, absolutely.
And you can dispute strategies just like coaches dispute play calling. Right. But the fact you're disputing play calling means there's a game going on. The very fact you're disputing approaches or metaphors or structure means you've accepted the premise that something is going on.
Right.
It would be pretty silly to debate plays and not be playing football, or debate plays and not care about the game, right?
Yeah.
The moment you debate approaches, you've accepted the premise that there's something you're approaching, that there's something there, and that's right, and that's philosophy then.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. And I'll just say one more thing that was coming to mind was that, you know, you kept saying like this. The great metaphysicians, like they said that they had that sense of, wow, we are in something, right?
We're in something
that's
we must
already
be
happening, right? It's intelligible.
Yes.
And it makes me think about language itself, right?
Yes.
Language itself is that thing which you are thrown into in infancy. Where
you say, language is huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's like it's been going on for many centuries, you know, and then you're in it, and it's amazing how well it's seemingly seamless, or how do I put this? It's seemingly effortless, though it takes a lot of effort in many ways. But it's it's a childlike exploration and language acquisition, which comes through like the little babbles and the little sounds and the repetition all the time to get to the place where you can say a sentence or something like that. And nevertheless, even when you have language, there's always that mystery of like, why can't I say the thing that the person will then just understand me, right? Or I can achieve the thing I want to say. Like, these aren't, they're like, it's wild, and it's a mystery, but it's still something where like, okay, is it beneficial to you to learn a language or not? And that's why I kind of wanted to say, like I was saying before, we actually do live our lives. Like, we might say, this is like, that's a crap analogy, and like, we're not in a game, and it's not football, and blah, blah, blah. You still live as if you do. Like, the fact that you learn language at all, you could choose not to, okay? And maybe you say, well, I didn't have a choice. I had to learn it, right? Yeah. But this is the thing, I didn't have a choice. I'm in football now, right? I'm in this thing. I don't know what it is. They have a ball. They're throwing it around. They got helmets. Language to me is a really beautiful example of what we are in, like what we get thrown into. And then we learn, right? Or we don't have to learn, or we didn't choose to learn, in a sense. But eventually we choose to continue with it, right? We choose to continue with it. Or maybe we learn some other languages. I don't know. There's not a whole lot of people who, some might take a vow of silence for the rest of their lives. Maybe people who are monastic or something like that, right? And that's, again, all valid choices. But the point of the matter is that we do start to learn it, and we use it, and we use it a lot, even though we know it's not like the answer to everything, right? That's why you have so much ability to have miscommunication. And it's like, it doesn't necessarily just fix everything to know it, but at least you know it and you can do better. You can try to have better conversations, right? And then you learn also when you shouldn't really be talking or whatever. But it's just, to me, it's an important thing that, and I know it's maybe it's a little bit of a cop-out to be like, well, language shows we do this anyway, but I do think it's an important example that we do end up, doing something with the order that we get thrust into.
I mean, language is arguably the most common or important topic of philosophy. Like, language is the game of football that you're in. Right. Like, you're in language, so you're metaphysical. Yeah. Like, that's why, like, Plato with the act of language, dialogos, circling, Wittgenstein, there's a Walker Percy. Like, language is at the heart of this problem, and language is like you're using language. Well, that's crazy, because language is not reducible to facticity, and it's there, and you're in it, and you're already using it. So something's going on, and words have power. Words can hurt. Words can tackle. Words can coordinate. Words are always. Can
relieve. I mean, words
it's like Wittgenstein said, like language games. You're like the moment you speak, you're in a game, like just like that. Yeah. Like you've created a situation, and so that right there means that, like, the very fact that you can use words, a philosopher's like, so we must be in something, like, and something intelligible and something handed down that maintains intelligibility through tradition and coordination of human action that is not reducible to facts. And also, if I say something to you, it can really have causal impact in reality. I can say, go pick up the cup, and you will do it. Cause and effect, out of nowhere. Like, that language is absolutely one of the key suggestions that you are in something. You are in something. And then the question of what are the rules of this thing I'm in? I'm in football. What are the rules of this thing I'm in that seems to be happening? Let me go try to find out. And maybe after 80 years, you only get to the place where you figured out that there's a difference between the people on the field and on the sidelines. And then the next generation says the people on the sidelines go by the name coaches. And then the next generation says, and actually they're the ones calling the play, and you build and you build and you build. Like, that's the other thing. Like, philosophy is a growing, it is a tradition of gathering together intelligibility about this thing that we find ourselves in, that there are consequences for not having good strategies. And we're trying to figure out the best strategy. But the issue is that question of strategy is tied deeply to language, because the problem we're in is language. So it's like, so what's the best metaphor? What's the best emphasis? Being or becoming? Nothing? What about action? Should we take it on so we talk about phenomenology or ethics? These are all efforts.
Just write stories.
What's the best approach? Because, like, what's the best play? What's the best strategy? What's the best... Like, it's all an effort of this groping around for the best approach. It's like, well, let's emphasize ethics. No, let's emphasize aesthetics. No, let's emphasize ontology. Those are all different playbooks. Those are all different strategies. Those are all different emphasis. And sometimes for one season, the Patriots playbook is the best. For another season, it's the Chiefs, and so on and so forth. So you need to be versatile. Good coaches can change their playbooks. Likewise, good human beings can change their playbooks based on the season of life, right? And so language is huge here, because language suggests humans are not animals. And animals don't have philosophy. But we're clearly not animals. That we have language. That doesn't mean we're not made of language, but we're certainly not reducible to animals. That alone provides a mystery. We're in something distinct from animals. Right. Okay, what is this thing that we're in? Well, it must be tied to language, because we're capable of language in a way animals are not. So that seems to be a big hint. So let's really study language and how language works. That's what a lot of philosophers have done. And they've used that to work up the analogy of being, the ladder, like climb the ladder from this thrownness to some sort of sense of the order by things operate, hence the best approach. Yeah. And again, you must have an approach. And if you must have an approach, then you must play. If you're you're playing. So you can't say, well, I'm just not going to have an approach. Well, that's your approach. Can't get out of it.
Exactly. There's no escape. Well, that's the funny thing, is that, if we want to talk about, like, I don't know, like the concept of failing, futility, or such things, there's really, like, that's what's funny about it, is like, yeah, there is a futility.
Yes.
you don't have a way to not have an answer.
Yeah. That's right. It's kind of empowering futility, though.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to see it that way, other people may not. I mean, but no, I think that's the funny thing. Is like it's almost like futility can't even be futility.
No.
It's because guess what? It still ends up being a type of response.
Yes.
Even not responding is a response, and that's.
But if you understand,
but that's important because I think then you also are. It's humbling. It's just very humbling because there's a humility in recognizing that posture, because then it's not so much like, seeing the people who seem to be trying in the football game or whatever, right? They're trying to learn the rules. Like, you could just be like, well, that's stupid. Well, why is it stupid?
Yeah.
That's their response right now.
Yes.
Right? Now, your response might be to just keep standing there, right?
And praying you don't get tackled, yes.
Right.
Well,
but like you see what I'm saying? Like, it's a kind of, it's not...
It's futile to try to be futile. Like, it's futile to try to be futile because you're taking an approach. You can't not take an approach.
Well, that's the futility of futility, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's fine. That's great. I mean, I think there's something great about that in the sense that it shows that even there's always a failure of all things, even a failure, right? So that there's a kind of... To me, it seems sublational. Like, at that point, it's like, well, it doesn't have to be. I guess you could efface it, I suppose, right? But there's a way in which that moment becomes a sublational opportunity.
Well, the key is that when you say, well, even failure fails, that usually tends to mean that there's no redemption from failure. But really, what that means is there's no avoiding of trying to succeed. Like, there's
even in failing.
Yes. So here's the thing. It only makes sense to say, I'm not going to take an approach. If by approach you're thinking of that metaphorically in problems and solutions. But if you must take a strategy, then to say, well, I'm not going to have a strategy, makes no sense. Like, you are taking a strategy. It makes no sense to say that. So likewise, when you say, well, even failure fails, or, we have to, even quit trying, or something like that, that only makes sense as then leading you in the direction of doing nothing in a problem-solution metaphor. But in the metaphor of approach, if you say even failure fails, well, that means then you must take an approach. Like, it's not going to mean why even try or not even look in redemption. It means that you're alive.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing. That's why I think it's challenging, because the way we've been essentially conditioned to think about anything really is really in terms of problem solution.
Yes.
But then we kind of want to, I don't want to say rebel, but we get kind of frustrated with that, because honestly that model is not comprehensive enough. It's not nuanced enough, honestly, because it doesn't take into account a lot of this, what we're talking about, which is this ongoing thing, right? And so then it's like, well, no, there's it's sort of like it's not, it's not accurate, or it's kind of it's futile, or it's a failure to think about in terms of problem and solutions. Well, yeah, but that's not because there's not anything going on. It's because what's going on is going to require more so strategy, and even that word strategy will also get reduced to the kind of phenomenological experience of what we think of, which is again just what systematically we tend to think about these things. Yeah. But really, it's like this. It's much more of a type of situating ourselves in what we are already in.
Well, problems and solutions, yes, it does. Problems and solutions is the epistemology of being or nothing. Mm-hmm. But the epistemology of becoming is strategy. Mm-hmm. Like, if things are becoming, if things are processes and transformations and relations, then the proper epistemology is strategy. It makes no sense to talk about problems and solutions unless things are beings with the S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I didn't mean to use that voice well, we can't think of things and problems, because I really empathize with that. The idea of well, yeah, we can all say this, but really we're just trying to what that boils down to is here's the problem and here's the solution. But that's the thing. Our brains just so quickly do that, without us even intending to, that but that's a product of thinking about certain things for a long time, and that's understandable, right? In a way, I guess that's tied to probably our survival too. But there's this way in which we rebel against it, but then even that rebelling is still in that same form, where it's not actually in a sense, a true rebellion.
It's overfitting, but because problems and solutions is proper metaphor for beings, and the closest entity to beings are objects. You tend to be able to pretty reliantly think in problems and solutions when dealing with objects. Like the door is broke. Well, the solution is getting a new door. Okay, right. Because objects are like beings, even if technically even they are becomings in the Hegelian sense.
Yeah.
But it's the epistemology works well enough.
Yeah.
It's practical enough. But when you move to humans, if you use an epistemology of problems and solutions, you're overfitting. It won't work because humans, except to the regard that you are addressing more object-like needs of the human, say bodies. Oh, you have a cut, solution, Band-Aid, right? Like the more object parts of the human, you might be able to make a problem-solution metaphoric structure work. But when you get to the, dare I say, mental, spiritual, emotional, that ain't gonna work because these parts are processes. The more you're moving to something like a process or a continuum, then the more you are becoming, the more you need to epistemologically think in terms of strategies. That's the mistake, is people are not switching epistemology as they move from object to subject, if you will, as they move from being to process. And so that leads to trouble.
Right, because then people are thinking about discussions on it as the former, right?
Yes.
And not moving into the subjective.
Yes.
And so... But the mindset is still, everybody's still thinking in terms of problems and solutions when maybe they are, but it's actually a whole different ballgame.
It's a whole different ballgame. Well, let's look at it this way.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It's like Cadell talks about the science of subject of science, and Hegel and different things. Yeah. Like, you can talk about problems and solutions when dealing with the football. Okay, there's a hole in the football. Let's fix it. You can talk about the pads in the football game. Okay, we need new pads. But you can't talk about problems and solutions about the game of football. The game of football is strategy, even if the objects in football can be talk about in terms of problems and solutions.
Or there's objectives to the game or something.
Yes, that's correct. But the game of football as a whole is a matter of strategy.
It's not a and that's it's a good way to think about it, because it's like, is the game of football itself a problem?
No, it is a situation. It is a game. That's why Leibniz was adamant that we needed to think of life geometrically as a situation.
Yeah. I guess it's only a problem in so much as you don't want to play. It's a problem for you because you don't want to play.
But that doesn't mean football's a problem. No, that's just an inadequate. That language doesn't work. It's too clunky of a metaphor.
It is clunky,
but we're trying to use that language when dealing with processes, so we get all confused.
Mm-hmm. We also assume people are using that framework in terms of having conversations.
Yes.
It's like, no, it's like you said. I think it's an overfitting sometimes. It
is an overfitting because
it's not. But see, it's so hard not to think of it as it. It's like, well, that's just a facade to say it's not, because it clearly seems to be, right? And it's like, well, is there actually like a sitting with what's being?
But here's the problem. You basically need philosophy to tell the difference.
Yeah.
So if you've disowned philosophy, you're in the total despair of Kierkegaard, unable to know you're even in despair.
It's true.
I mean, look, the issue is, too, that basically processes and continuums are invisible. So you only see objects, things of which the epistemology of problem and solution is adequate.
Yeah.
Thus, you think naturally of everything as that. Because in a funny way, football is invisible within football. You don't actually see football, you see the things of football. And the things of football are independently entities which an epistemology of problems and solutions is adequate. Therefore, it seems as if problems and solutions is adequate for the entirety of football. But once you move up the chain to the content, like to the whole situation of which the things of football make up, it then switches to strategy epistemology. But football itself is in a way invisible. That's why it's so easy to make this mistake, because life in a way is invisible.
Yep.
Like the objects of life are not. Therefore, the only things you ever see are that of which an epistemology of problem and solutions is fitting. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that epistemology is always fitting. And what are you people talking about? Life, football. What do you see? All I see is a football and players. There's no football. Like next you're going to be talking about God or something. And also, basically, God as a word often in philosophy is a placeholder for the entire situation of the cosmos that you only ever see the objects of and never the entire situation of, right? And so that's important too. I mean, the other thing too that's just very important, if somebody says, well, I don't need an approach, show me a moment when you're not in an approach. Like, show me a moment. Like, you always take an approach toward books. Always. Like, so quickly, like when you encounter a person, you so quickly and subconsciously and instinctually take a certain approach on based on their tone, based on what they're saying, based on their attitude. Yeah. All human beings are like like you're always taking an approach. So that's also the idea of I'm not going to worry about philosophy. Well, then you're not worrying about approaches, and then you're like, well, yeah, because I don't do approaches. Yes, you do. Like that's another thing. Philosophy would be like, you're in a mode. You're always in a mode. Yeah. You're always in a mood, as Heidegger would say. You're always in an approach. All human beings take on an approach instinctually, reading body language, emotionally, reading the vibe, reading the field. You're like an approach master. Yeah. Like human beings are like freaking approach masters. So if you're like, nah, I don't worry about approach. Yeah, well, you do it. You certainly do it. Like you are always going into approach. So it's simply false consciousness, dare I say.
Yeah, exactly.
It's simply false consciousness. If you say, well, approach doesn't matter. Well, then stop doing it. Then stop doing it. And you never do. You can't.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because even if you go and become a hermit, like, that's your approach.
That's your approach.
Yeah.
So philosophy is basically, to study philosophy is to accept that you must approach.
Yep, exactly.
And belonging, again, will necessarily then be a matter of accepting, it will be a matter of strategy and approach, not problems and solutions.
Yeah.
So it has to be about an environment, a field, tracing out of a situation of which then we have to choose a better strategy and approach to address.
Yeah.
That's why we call it an address, not a solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's not, problem solution, it's explanation and address.
Yeah.
Because the address is like, this is how you address this thing that we explained. Mm-hmm. This is how you address football. you don't get tackled. You catch the ball.
Yeah,
like,
I think, too, those words lend themselves to subjectivity, too.
Yes, that's
because,
exactly
right.
It's
almost like, when like, kids are talking about, well, let me explain my side, right? Like, well, this is what I saw, or this is what happened.
Yes.
Like, this is my side of the story, right? Like, let me explain it.
Yes.
When people say that, it's always this emphasis on, let me explain,
yes.
right? Usually. So there's this emphasis on the subjectivity, and same with address, right?
Yes.
How do they address this? How do they address that, right?
Yes.
It's this kind of, it's really integrally related to the subject or subjectivity, and I think that's important because it's the other issue with problem solutions, though they exist and are necessary, is that they often can remove the human element. They're much more formulaic, yes. And there's a place for those things. However, they're not going. That's going to be an overfit for a lot of actually kind of understanding a bit more about, like, well, what is this game? Now you might choose to not understand it or understand it differently, but that will be then your explanation, your address, right? So,
well,
yeah.
I mean,
I just think that's interesting because those words are important.
Yeah, they're definitely words of a science of subject.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, again, belonging traditionally, you could find in simply problems and solutions. If you could solve your problems, you could get belonging. To belong again, we must think in terms of strategies. We must think in terms of situations. We must think in terms of approaches and towardness. That's the only way you're going to belong again, because the game has unveiled itself in a more complex way. Like you could say, we went through a period of history where we had to get the balls ready. We had to make sure that there weren't holes in it. We had to make sure the padding was there. So it was an objective science. It was the science of problems and solutions. Well, we did all that, and then, wait a minute, people are taking all these objects we used and, like, playing some game with it. What's going on? It turns out that the game was global pluralism. The game was ultimately network connections and relations, and it's like, what's going on? Like this, and now this is where the science of the science of subject comes out, precisely in the collision, the clash of otherness and difference, and that's the game. And if you want to belong again, then you're going to need to figure out the best strategy and approach for this reality of global pluralism, and that's what we talked about in the class.
Yeah. It was great.
It was wonderful. We really enjoyed it. We're grateful to Parallax for it, and we're grateful for everyone who was there.
Yes, very much
And
so.
for more from Parallax, please check out their website, YouTube, the work that they do. And for more by OG Rose, please visit YouTube, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.